Good morning. My name is Michael Burke, and I'm a member of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit's Archives Committee. And I'm here this morning to interview Peter Alter for the Oral History Project sponsored by the Leonard N. Simons Jewish Community Archives. The purpose of this project is to gather and preserve information for historical, scholarly, educational, and non-commercial uses. A DVD recording will be made and a copy will be kept at the archives. Peter, you will receive a copy. Unless restricted below, other institutions and persons may obtain copies of this interview. These materials may be made available for the purpose of research, instructional use, publication, or other related purposes. Peter, we're here together. Do you agree to the conditions of this interview?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful. And we'll have a signed copy that we can put in the records of the archives. So let's get started. So Pete, tell us about your formative years. I know you a little bit, and I know that you're not a Detroiter by birth. You were born in New York. So why don't you just give us a little summary of your early years as a young man in New York?
My early years as a young man, or even before being a
Even
young
bef-
man,
even
being a
before.
young man in New York. Well, first of all, my parents are survivors. I'm first generation. My father came here after the war. He had been in Poland and then in Italy during the war, ending up working in counterintelligence for the United States government before he arrived in the United States. And my mother came from Belgium, and she graduated from medical school in 1941 in Brussels. And actually, my dad graduated from medical school in Czechoslovakia in 1939. And my mother worked in the Belgian underground after she got out of medical school, and was to say a strong anti-fascist is an understatement. She was a strong socialist and was that way to her dying day. So that was the background with which I grew up. I went to yeshiva. My parents were not at all religious, but my mother felt that it was important for us to get a Jewish education so that we would be able to make our own choices. And she said, how can you decide whether you want to be religious or not religious, observant or not observant, if you don't know what it's about? So, although my mother, consistent with being a strong socialist, was also an atheist, she sent us to yeshiva. And we learned everything you learn when you go to yeshiva. At the same time, my parents got divorced when I was about 8.5 years old. Fairly traumatic, fairly unusual in those days in a sort of professional Jewish family for that to go on. I lived with my mother and maintained some relationship with my dad for a number of years, but not a close relationship. I was very close with my mother and my brother, who is a 1.5 years younger than I am and still lives in New York. And I guess this relevant for these purposes, the single most important thing to say is my brother ended up living in Israel for about 6 years as a journalist before moving back to the States in about 1980 to join CBS, where he's been for the last 31 years and has been foreign editor at CBS News and is a senior producer for 48 Hours.
Wonderful. So we're going to talk about your education and the influence the education had on your forming your opinions of things. But I'm curious, now that you've talked about your parents, you talked about the interesting background that they had. How did they meet?
They met studying for the medical boards in New York. Obviously, when you come over, as they did in 1945, they both had to take the medical boards in order to practice medicine. They both took them, they both passed them, and they both practiced medicine in New York for many, many years.
So they didn't know each other in Europe?
No, not at all. Not at all.
And tell us a little bit about what they did during the war. I think that would be interesting.
Well,
start with your dad, and then maybe we'll morph into your mom.
My dad graduated from medical school in 1939 and never went back to his hometown in Lvov, which was then in Poland and now is in the Ukraine. It had already been occupied by the Nazis, and he never went back there. His whole family was killed during the war. Not that he ever knew those details. He decided, for reasons I guess best known to him, that with the last name Alter and the first name Igor, he could pass. And he got false papers without having to even change his name, and decided that he would go to Leipzig, which was in Germany. And he went and was an intern and a resident at a hospital in Leipzig, using false papers, of course. And he stayed there for a while, and he had what he called the Plan B in mind if he ever got caught. And as it turned out, the head of the SS or something in a suburb of Leipzig had the last name Alter, and he claimed that guy as his cousin anytime he could or needed to. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, at one time he was accosted by several SS members, and they came into his office there in the hospital, and they told him that they knew he was a Jew, and they were going to arrest him, and that they were going to do whatever they had to do to him. And of course, he denied it up and down, and invoked the name of his, quote, cousin, unquote, and said, when my cousin finds out what you're doing, it's you guys who are going to be in trouble, not me. And they said, okay, they're going to check on it, and they'll get back to him. That was the last day that my father was in Leipzig. And somehow or other, he made his way to Italy, because he spoke a lot of languages. He spoke all the Romance languages, all the Slavic languages, English, and a couple of others for good measure. And he went to Italy, where he somehow got involved in counterintelligence. He was a very strong amateur tennis player, and I remember him telling me that at one time he had the opportunity while in Italy to play tennis with King Farouk, of all people. So I don't think it was a close match, but
surprised the king could even get his way around the
yes,
courts.
that would be surprising. As I said, he ended up somehow in counterintelligence, and actually before he ever set foot in the United States, he was a captain in the United States Army. Then after the war, he came to the States and took the medical boards or exams and met my mom, and the rest is history.
Okay, so tell us about your mom.
And my mom came from a very strong Zionist family.
Did your father have a Zionist background too? Or?
He had a Zionist background, but it never seemed to be quite as strong as my mother's. Let's say as my mother's family, mm-hmm. Or as my mother's. And my mother grew up in Antwerp, in Belgium, and as with many of the families and Jewish families in Antwerp, my grandfather and his son, my uncle, were involved in the diamond and watch business in Antwerp. And in 1932 or thereabouts, my uncle, my mother's brother, emigrated to Palestine, what we really know as Palestine. And he was there for a while, and there were certain immigration problems that he encountered, and he eventually came to Vineland, New Jersey, ended up living in the United States. All the while, my mother was in Belgium in the 30s, and she was 4 years younger than her brother. She was going to school, went to medical school, and along with her best friend. So she and her best friend, who both came from Orthodox Jewish families, very Orthodox families, were sort of the exception to the rule. And my mother's mother, my grandmother, said to my mother, "Yeti, what's wrong with philology? Don't you like languages? Why do you have to go to medical school? And of course, her father, who knew better and knew his daughter, said, no, leave her alone. That's just the way she is. She wants to go to medical school. So she was quite a bit ahead of her time, and was a very determined person. And she went through medical school, and after medical school, she ended up working for years in the Belgian underground. My grandfather was smuggled into Switzerland before the Swiss closed the border. So maybe the word smuggled isn't quite necessary, I don't know. But then the determination was made that my grandmother and my mother would follow. He was going to set up shop, so to speak, in Switzerland in the watch business, which kind of made a lot of sense. My uncle wasn't there, so they were going to, they didn't have to, he wasn't somebody they were concerned about at the time. Then suddenly, as my mom used to like to say, the friendly Swiss closed the border. And they closed the border, and the guide who was going to take them across told her that it was okay, that he could still take them across and there wouldn't be a problem. And my mother said, well, have you taken anybody across since they've closed the border? And he said, no, I haven't taken anybody across. So my mother said to him quite understandably, how do you know there's not going to be a problem? She said, I don't want to be the first problem that you have there. So they decided not to go across the border, and they stayed in Belgium. It was at least for a 3-year period. And they made some arrangements through my grandfather and another businessman, a non-Jewish businessman in Belgium, to have, in effect, phony business transactions every month, so that there would be a way for my grandfather to send money to Belgium, and that money in turn would find its way to my mother and grandmother. They left Antwerp and were hidden in a church in Brussels for a while, all arranged through the underground movement, through the White Brigade that my mother was associated with in Antwerp. And after maybe a month or two in the church, they found their way to an apartment in, let's say, an area that was not a central part of Brussels. And they lived upstairs and downstairs from each other with false papers as aunt and niece, not as mother and daughter. Because if they were looking for you, and they said it's a mother and daughter, so they had different names. Right. And my mother's name happened to be her Mademoiselle Henri, Miss Henry. And I remember she's telling me this story that she wanted to show to the landlady that they were, okay. That in effect they weren't Jews, you didn't have to worry about them. And obviously you'd have to get, the way you got food is through the ration stamps that you had, and if you were Jewish, there was no way you could get it. So the first week that they're in that apartment, my mother says to the landlady, would you be kind enough to pick up our food? Here are the ration coupons. And the landlady very politely said, no problem, be glad to do it. And my mother gave her a little tip, and she brought it back. And then the following week, she did the same thing, and the landlady said, no problem, glad to do it. Then the third time that my mother asked her, the landlady said, listen, I'm happy to do it. I just want you to know that the priest at the church is my son. So word was out, and I don't know if she ever had the landlady do that again, because the point had been made. There are a lot of other stories that could be told.
They basically, as much as they could, they stayed in plain sight rather than
they both
rather than going underground. Your mother, when she was in the White Brigade and in the underground, was it as did she use her skills as a physician, or was she in other venues, so to speak?
Well, it's a good question, and she never really talked about it a lot. There are some isolated stories that we know. But when we were back in Antwerp a few years ago, my mother's cousin, who's about 88, a couple of years ago, and her husband, who was 90, the Silbers, Bernard and Rachel Silber, told us some stories, and they were surprised that we didn't know them, including the fact that Rachel and her sister also were taken care of and were in a convent in part of Belgium that was near France. And I said, no, I never knew that you were in a convent. She said, I said, yeah, how did you manage to do that? She said, your mother took care of it. I said, how did she do that? Through the White Brigade. So those contacts and the works that she did, you know, were not only altruistic, but also, you know, helped some of the family members. And I remember when my mother passed away about 8 years ago, kind of in response to the question you were asking, we got calls from a number of people, and we were telling different folks what happened. And some relatives of ours in New York, where my mom still lived, who we really hadn't seen very much at all. I mean, we were living in Detroit. Their last name was Goldberg. Called us up and said, we're going to come to your mom's funeral, of course. We couldn't do any less. And when they came, I said, well, what do you mean you couldn't have done any less? They said, the husband and his wife said that when the husband was 5 years old and his sister was 2 or 3 years old, my mother smuggled them out of Germany by getting false papers coming from Belgium, working in the Belgian underground, smuggling them out with false papers under some medical pretext that you needed some kind of medical care, and got them out. So they felt, as they said, they didn't remember it happening, but they know that it happened, and they were fairly grateful, and understandably so.
Yeah, and your mother never really talked much about these stories.
Very, very little. I mean, there were a few stories.
They were very personal to her, yeah.
You know, they were personal, but my mother was never someone who bragged about anything that she did, you know. So, you know, in later years, people would ask her name was Yeti. He would say, Yeti, you know, what do you think of women's lib? And she would say, think about women's lib? I am women's lib. You know, she just did the stuff, and it just kind of came naturally, and she was my most significant role model in every way.
So how did, moving forward, how did the fact that your mother and your father, to an extent, were who they were, and they were survivors in really every sense of the word, even though they were not in the camps. How did it formulate your focus in life, Jewishly and otherwise, for that matter?
You know, as a kid, I probably very, very rarely thought about it as a young kid. And part of the reason for that, I think, was, as I review it, I went to yeshiva. And my story was hardly a unique one. You know, there were lots of kids at my yeshiva whose parents were survivors, many of whom were in camps, had much more difficult, tougher stories, and it was just part of who all of what we were as a group and who we were as a group. So that, you know, never seemed to be of great significance in my younger years. And I just kind of took it in stride. It was just, that's who I am, you know.
So was it the yeshiva that kind of formulated your Jewish feelings initially? Or were there other factors, Peter?
Well, you know, it's a combination of everything. I certainly think, you know, who my parents were was foremost, but who my parents were also is what in substantial part caused them to do what they did and me to be who I am, both in terms of yeshiva, in terms of my love of Hebrew, as much as anything else, my love of Israel. You know, my brother and I went to a Hebrew-speaking camp. And when I say a Hebrew-speaking camp, I don't mean a place where it was okay if you spoke Hebrew once in a while. If you didn't speak Hebrew, you would not be able to get along because no counselor would speak to you in English. And if you said anything to them in English, the common answer was lo hivanti. I didn't understand, you know. So, you know, that was part of it. But in direct response to your question, I think really when I got out in the real world, outside the yeshiva world, I realized that my situation and my upbringing and my story was different than the average person's. And that sort of raised my consciousness more. I knew everything, but seeing the rest of the world out there. So to an extent, high school, you know, when I stopped going to yeshiva, you know, you could see a little bit of that, although the high school was very substantially Jewish. And then I went to college at Brandeis. That was very substantially Jewish. So can we call that the real world? Yeah, in a way.
In a way.
In a way you can. And the situation was different there. But really once I got into law school, you know, I remember starting out at Columbia, and you know, you've heard the background I've had where, you know, obviously everybody at yeshiva is Jewish, and I looked around my first week at Columbia, and it seemed to me like less than a third of the kids were Jewish. I said, what's going on here? How come there's so few Jews? Later I found out that was a lot of Jews to have in a class.
That was the real world.
So that was the real world, you know, and maybe even a better version of the real world in a lot of ways. So that's...
Were you involved in any, as you were growing up through the, you know, the various phases, the yeshiva, high school, you know, college, and then law school, were you involved in Jewish things, Jewish issues, Jewish
you know,
programs? Was that part of your agenda at all?
I was always interested in politics, but I never was, you know, I never was involved in any organized Jewish activities growing up. Through yeshiva years, through 9th grade, you know, look, we got there at about 7:30 in the morning, left at 4:45 in the afternoon. Probably not a lot of time to do...
to eat dinner and go to sleep.
Well, yeah, little homework too,
Little homework.
especially in the later years, you know, a lot of Gemara and Chumash and stuff like that. Probably didn't appreciate it as much then as I do now, but in high school, I was active, but not in Jewish activities, more like, you know, yearbook, newspaper kinds of things, and productions, school productions and things like that. In college, you know, a little more, but nothing really Jewish. My really real Jewish awakening, if you will, in terms of organizational activities, came to me, you know, as I was finishing law school. I said, you know, I want to become involved in the Jewish community, wherever I would. What
was the precipitating factor that brought that light bulb to go on the top of your head?
You know, I don't know if there was a precipitating factor, but I can tell you that in the spring of 1970 was the whole events with the war in Vietnam and the invasion issues and riots on the campuses, and first year exams at Columbia Law School were suspended, and a lot of political activity took place. And I was very involved in what was called Movement for a New Congress in New York. Probably nobody ever heard of it anymore.
Yeah,
but
what was it? Sounds interesting.
It was trying to get the right people elected to Congress, just a different name for the same thing people are doing. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but obviously to me, I was on the Democratic side of the aisle. Haven't moved from there in 40 years and don't intend to, but that's another story. As a result of all of that, and hearing stories from a lot of other men and women at law school with me and what different people were doing, and hearing about different members of my class and what their parents were doing in terms of various activities, a lot of which related to the Jewish community. I said, that's something I want to get involved in. And, you know, looking back on it, it was in my DNA. It just seemed like a very natural thing to do. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I remember my mom giving me a card from ZOA, a ZOA membership card to a 10 or 11-year-old and saying, keep this card. If you have this card, you're always in good shape. And frankly, I don't think she'd be an active member of ZOA today, but, and I don't know how ZOA was back 50 years ago, but it was just an exemplar of her Zionist commitment. And whatever commitment I might have, you know, just to me, completely pales in comparison to the real commitment that my folks, particularly my mom, made. So it's child's play by comparison, really and truly.
But you know, there are children who've had the same background who kind of divorced themselves from these things, and you did quite the opposite. You involved yourself and continue to involve yourself. So you know, I think that's an important thing to state for the record. I can state it.
Well, thanks. But you know what? It just it really was just something I was truly drawn to, and once I started, never looked back.
Yeah.
No particular aspirations when I did it. Just felt a strong commitment. Didn't make my first trip to Israel until I was an adult. And you know, and trips
was it
to
in Detroit or
in Detroit. In Detroit. A couple of years after I got here, it was part of Israel Bonds, actually. You know, new leadership for Israel Bonds. So the idea of new leadership, that's as old as can be. And some friend of mine invited me to do it, and I got involved and was involved in the what was then called the junior division, Michael, as you know. Lillian Bernstein in the junior division.
I do know.
And
how did you get to Detroit? Look, before we get into
just lucky.
So we are,
and I mean that. You know.
So tell us what got you here.
Well, at Brandeis, I started to date a woman whom I married, Ellen Chandler, and she was from Detroit. And frankly, when I was dating her, if you had said to me, well, what are the chances you'll move to Detroit? I would have said somewhere between zilch and zero, nada. You know, never really crossed my mind. And once I was in law school, and Ellen was in law school as well. She was a couple of years behind me. She started at Columbia when I was in my last year, and then she switched to Michigan. We started thinking about where we were going to live. And neither one of us were sort of strongly committed to the idea of coming to Detroit, but neither of us rejected the idea. So we looked around and thought about going to Chicago, thought about staying in New York. She did not want to stay in New York. And I didn't feel strongly that I wanted to stay there. We said, who do we know in Chicago? Nobody. Now, in those days, it wasn't quite the same thing. You know, maybe if I were graduating today, Chicago would seem like the natural place if you grew up in Detroit, as it is for many. So I checked out a few law firms, and I was fortunate enough to be interviewed by the Honigman firm, Honigman, Miller, Schwartz & Cohn, and there was a match.
So you started to write with Honigman.
Started with Honigman.
Straight from law school, basically.
Without passing go, without collecting $200, and we're on our way.
And you were with Honigman for?
36 years. And as I say, every 30 years or so, I need to make a move. So I've got one move left, but I came here to Jaffe, Rate, Ewer, and Weiss 3 years ago. It's been a great 3 years, and hope to have many, many more.
Now, you talked about the junior division and your involvement with Federation. I've known you for a long time. My first recollection of you was not at Federation particularly, it was more at ADL and in that whole agenda. And so you know, even though we're here for the Archives of Federation, I want you to talk about your involvement with ADL and the influence that had in formulating your opinions about things, political and otherwise, in the community and in the world.
Well, actually, you do know me a long time, and I know you a long time, and you've been a big part of this community for more years than I have. So that means just that you're older than I am, Michael. Not by much. But here's the story. I mean, truly, I think I did start initially in the junior division, but I got more active more quickly in ADL. And Dick Lobenthal was the director of ADL here in Michigan for decades. He was a fantastic executive director. He was passionate about what he did.
One of a kind.
One of a kind, and conveyed that passion to many people. And we had a group of people who were involved with ADL. It was Bob Naftali who got me really involved with ADL. And Bob and I have been friends for not quite 40 years, but more than 35. And he was involved, a guy named John Jacobs was involved. My former partner, Chuck Tobias, may he rest in peace. Yep, was involved. And a cadre of young, committed, hopefully somewhat passionate folks. And a number of other folks who were at Honigman, as Chuck was. A little later, Stuart Lockman, Norm Beitner, and Rob Gordon from, was it Jaffe? Elaine Block. All of us got involved, and it was really because of Dick and Dick's passion, Dick's commitment that really got us going, and having a chance to voice our opinion on the issues of the day. And Dick started to get us involved in ADL, both locally and then slowly, but not that slowly, nationally. And there was a young guy working at ADL in New York that we all befriended, a young guy 30 some odd years ago by the name of Abe Foxman. Abe was the, I don't know what his exact title was, but you know, Director of Young Leadership, that's what it was. He was the young leadership guy, and Perlmutter was the head of ADL. Maybe it was even Arnold Forster back then. But Abe was a big influence as well in those days, and we had a lot of young Jewish leaders from around the country. Donnie Mintz from New Orleans and Michael Aronson from New Orleans, and folks from all over the place who were just very strong about their support for things Jewish and things Israel or Israeli. And we got very involved. I got very involved in the ADL Law Department, ADL Civil Rights Committee, and ADL International Affairs over a period of 20 years. And you know, I ended up being the chair of the International Affairs Committee in probably early 2000s. It was a great experience. Took a number of trips to Israel with ADL. Obviously, Abe Foxman went on to bigger and greater things at ADL. He's one of the most influential Jewish leaders in the country for a couple of decades now.
Ever, really.
He's an amazing guy, a guy I've always looked up to, and even sometimes when I disagreed with him, I thought he was brilliant in explaining his position. So ADL has been a strong part of my Jewish life, probably will continue to be. But when I became, you know, in 2004, when I became Federation president here, and I was just finishing up a 3-year term as chair of the International Affairs Committee for ADL, you kind of had to make a decision. Impossible to carry on a full-time law practice. We haven't talked about that much. A full-time law practice, be president of Federation and try to do something at ADL, and remain married. So that would not work. No, something would have to give. And I went and talked to Abe about it, and Abe understood, and obviously, wished me yasher koach, and whatever I was going to do at Federation, I was very excited about it. And so I stopped my involvement at that time in ADL just for lack of time, not for lack of interest. And never really got back to it, because when you're gone for 3 years, right. I mean, have I gone to any ADL events since then? Yes. But, I had my opportunities, and, the direction I went at that time was really Federation, and it was a great decision. I don't regret it in any way, but that's the story of ADL. And yeah, Abe has influenced me a lot over the years on issues from dealing with affirmative action things and quotas and timetables and goals to issues about Israeli politics and American-Israel relations, probably in a way that's second to none in terms of helping me shape my thinking. I think anytime somebody's attracted to an organization like that, obviously there has to be a connection that you feel with either the specific positions or the existing leadership. Otherwise, what's the attraction? And in the case of ADL, it was a lot of both. And it's been a great association.
And my guess is that those experiences at ADL had some influence on the way you deported yourself at Federation in terms of your feelings about community, about Israel, and all those other things, because
we're leaving out.
That's essentially where you got your, much of your training as a.
Well, you know what? We're leaving something out that's very important.
Let's put it in.
And it's really the seminal Jewish experience of my adult years that shaped my Jewish community activity. And that was my years on the UJ Young Leadership Cabinet.
Yeah, I have it in here, but we can talk about it now.
You know what? It was a confluence of events and circumstances coming together. The Young Leadership Cabinet was a passion of mine for 8 years or longer, but 8 years that I was on the cabinet. It was a fantastic group of people, a lot of role models that I had, both from this community and nationally. Larry Jacquier, Stanley Frankel from our own community, other folks like Joel Gershenson, who was enormously active in the Soviet Jewry movement in those days, were big influences on me and my thinking. Larry is the guy who one day said to me, "Why don't you go on the Young Leadership Cabinet?" And I said, "What? What's that?" And it was a significant, very significant Jewish experience in my life, because finding a bunch of other guys, and it was only guys at that time, who were as much zealots as I was about working for the community and committed to Israel. And of all my many trips to Israel, of which there are close to 50 now, and I know Larry's got me beat by a factor of 2, but nevertheless, it's a lot of trips, and I loved every one of them. But probably at least half of those trips were during the 8 years that I was, well, maybe not quite half, but a very substantial number when I was occurred while I was on the UJ Young Leadership Cabinet, easily going a couple times a year, just like the drop of a bucket. Can you go to Israel next week for 5 days? Sure, no problem. And it was the spirit, the ruach that was created by those guys. The experience was just unforgettable experience, culminating in having had an opportunity to chair the Washington Conference. I think it was the 3rd Washington Conference, UJ Young Leadership Conference in the mid-'80s. 3,000 young Jews from around the country coming together in Washington for 3 days. Super.
You know, we share that because I had a passing acquaintance with the young leadership.
You did.
You were my boys. And
right.
The thing that impressed me, as much as what you've suggested, is how that translated into community activity, and that you were not parochial, or when I say you, the collective you, was not parochial in its being Israelophiles, but rather you were interested in things Jewish and community in general. And if you take a look at the scorecard, particularly of that generation, people from the cabinet were really involved in many things. So, I mean, was that conscious with the cabinet when you were growing up with them, Peter, to really broaden influence in the community?
You know what, it was. And again, you got to give the credit to guys like Larry Jekier and Stanley Frankel. They were the folks that we looked up to. They weren't that much older than we were, but a little bit older. And they were coming back to the community and leading the way and showing us what to do. And we all followed in their footsteps. I left off guys like Richard Krugel, who's a very close friend then and still is a close friend. We came back. We not only wanted to do what was important for Israel, and what was important for Israel we thought benefited the community, but we wanted to do on the ground stuff that was important for our community. And one of the expressions we had is the best way to raise money is by raising Jews and letting everybody know what's important, giving people substantive information. You can say that's very similar to the way ADL operates. It is, and that's why I say everything kind of came together. Blind commitments to do things without understanding why you're doing it. That might have applied in some past generation, but that isn't the way our generation operated. And I hope we do a good job of educating our children and grandchildren so that they feel the same way about it as we do.
I was going to ask this later on, but since you raised it, what do you think of the challenge of the next generations? Will we be, in your opinion, will we be well served, not just by the generation that follows you, but by generations that follow them? And what do we as a community have to do to ensure that occurs?
It's interesting. There are a lot of challenges we face, and you could be asking that question about just Detroit. You could be asking it about the American Jewish community and the American Jewish experience in general. And I don't want to sound like an old guy when I say this, but I think the single most important issue that has faced and continues to face the American Jewish community to assure its survival going forward has been and will continue to be intermarriage. I think the dilutive effect, the dilution that takes place, not intentionally, but inexorably as a result of intermarriage, is just impossible to overstate. And ironically, my daughter was speaking to me last night and telling me that she had a long conversation with her brother, my son, the other day. And among the things they were talking about is friends and family members who've intermarried and what that means for the next generation of Jews, and how they're going to be able to be Jewish and maintain their Judaism. And there are no easy answers, but having a strong Jewish education is certainly a key. The thing I'm proudest of as a father and to a significant extent as a Jew is that both my kids went to Hillel Day School, where they got a terrific Jewish education. Not as intense as you would as if you went to yeshiva, but an education where they felt really good about being Jewish. They understand, I think, my kids do, what it means to be Jewish, and hopefully that will translate into a lot of positive things for the Jewish communities that they live in. And you know, my son's married to a great gal who, I don't want to say happens to be, who is Jewish and comes from a strong Jewish family. And hopefully when Jessica gets married, I know she feels the same way. Hopefully she'll want to marry, will marry. I know she wants to marry a Jewish guy. But
are you confident that enough people are like you in terms of their desire to instill that sense of the importance of Jewishness, if there's such a word, or does that concern you to a degree, or maybe it's a combination of both?
No, I'm not confident that people feel the same way as I do, because the way I feel is based on a lot of my experiences, which are very different from a lot of other people's. But truthfully, I think if you told every Jewish person, every Jewish parent in this town, that they could send their kid to day school for free or for a very nominal amount of money, you'd have a much stronger, committed Jewish populace and the next generation.
What are the possibilities of that, Peter, occurring in your lifetime?
Well, not on that level, but the only point I'm trying to make is that a lot of it is an issue of dollars and cents. And many folks might want to send their kids to a Jewish day school, but can't afford to. And others who aren't sure if they want to or not would do it if the price was right. They'd spend some money, but to ask parents to be able to spend, you know, $16,000, $18,000, $20,000 per kid, and many have 2 kids, some have 3 kids, some have fewer, but for a lot of years is a huge commitment to ask people to do. So it would be great if we as a community could find a way to fund more heavily than we do Jewish day schools, and to make it affordable. And I don't mean to bring down the cost by $2,000 or $3,000. That's not going to do the trick. Is that kind of wishful thinking? I'm sure it is, in a way. Is it within the realm of what can be imagined? It is. But you need 1 or 2 or 3 people, each willing to make a very substantial commitment to the future of Detroit Jewish community, and maybe, you know, Detroit's not unique. Jewish communities elsewhere. Otherwise, you know, I do have a lot of concerns about how strong the Jewish community will be. And I'm not even talking about at all from a religious perspective. There's so many other perspectives in terms of people's commitment to Israel, in terms of people's commitment to traditions, in terms of people's commitment to even attending synagogue, you know. So across the board, I think we need to think about the ways in which we can keep this community strong from a Jewish perspective, and how we can enhance that going forward. And I don't think it's an easy task at all.
I know, you know, in reading over the files and knowing you, because as I said, we've gone back a long way, Jewish education was always at the top of your agenda. Israel was there, but Jewish education was
You're
there.
right.
And I know that Jewish education was a seminal part of your presidency. I'm going a little out of order, but I think it's appropriate. And I know that that was, you know, every president has, you know, certain objectives. And I know that Jewish education wasn't the only thing, but it was very high on the list. So I'm curious for you to articulate the things that got accomplished during your presidency related to Jewish education, and where you think we have to go with Jewish education to keep it vibrant and vital in the community. That's a fair question, isn't it?
Anything you ask is a fair question, Michael. You know, I'll let others kind of determine what kind of successes we had or didn't have, but my strong commitment to Jewish education, which goes back a long time, decades, and transcends and precedes my involvement in this Jewish community, includes recognizing pretty much what I've been saying, why I think Jewish education is so important, finding ways to fund it, and finding ways to be innovative, even if we can't always be as financially productive as we'd like to be. So great support for the Alliance for Jewish Education, which is the umbrella organization inside our federation that is committed to developing and advancing Jewish education initiatives, was critical. But secondly, and equally or more important, we had been in kind of a lockstep mode in federation in the budgeting and allocation process. And if we had enough money to, and if the campaign in a given year, what we used to call the Allied Jewish Campaign, but we now call Federation's campaign, was up 2%, everybody would get 2% increase. I did not like that idea because I thought that there were certain priorities which had to be established, and that when I think of my role as a leader, I'd like to be able to help set the priorities and get people to follow maybe a little bit more than listening to what other people tell me the priorities are and seeing if I can go along with those. And I think we were successful in getting people to understand the importance of Jewish education and how additional dollars being devoted and allocated to Jewish education would make a difference. And so each of the years of my Federation presidency, if I'm recalling correctly, we allocated a disproportionate amount of the increased dollars to Jewish education. And when I say that, it's mostly for scholarship dollars. There's a certain amount of money that is at a threshold level that each of the organizations needs to run. And probably if I were looking at it today, I might think that we are still not providing enough dollars for Jewish education. Does that mean that we're wasting money elsewhere? No, it doesn't mean that we're wasting money. But when you're in a leadership role, you got to establish priorities. It is always very easy just to say, hey, Sally, S-A-L-Y, same as last year, we'll do the same thing. No, that's not good enough. Sometimes we have to say there are shifting priorities in the community. And I saw those priorities as Jewish education and care for the elderly. We have a large and growing elderly population that needs support. As you know, Michael, from the demographic study that we did during the time that I was president, we have the largest percentage of Jews that are over 65 than any other community in America, save Southern Florida. So that presents certain challenges, both because additional care is needed and because many of those more senior adults are not working and are not being able to contribute as much as they would otherwise or when they were younger to the Federation and to the campaign. And on the Jewish education side, we raise dollars and we have a commitment. I left something out and I left someone out, but as we're talking now, it comes to mind very, very vividly. The other very influential person in my Jewish life and my growth as a worker in the Jewish community was Bob Aronson, who has been a leader in this community and was the CEO of Federation for almost 20 years. Bob is a visionary. There's no two ways about it. And you know, the same way I was talking about Abe Foxman, you know, you get involved and you continue to be involved and you increase your involvement and you're pleased and excited about your involvement when you see yourself understanding what the person in charge, as Abe was, at ADL was doing, and finding that you were in agreement with him and that you were in sync with him. And I was very much in sync with Bob. Bob was in sync with me. I dare say if we weren't in sync, I probably wouldn't have been Federation president. And you know, maybe one of the reasons I was in sync with him is because he was able over a period of time to persuade me and to persuade others what the right direction was for the community. Bob's vision as a Jewish leader is second to none in this community, and probably, you know, what he continues to do in other areas like Birthright are just phenomenal. Everybody views his #1 skill as a fundraiser, and someone as knowledgeable and as experienced as Bill Berman has said to me, Bob Aronson might be the best Jewish fundraiser in the world. Now, maybe Bill's exaggerating, maybe Bob's only in the top 5, or maybe he's just in the top 10, but he's a hell of a fundraiser. And I'm getting to a point, but Bob's skills as a thinker, you know, Bob was an artist, so Bob's skills as an artist make him a little different kind of thinker than your average Jewish thinker, and he's a great thinker, and he's done a lot of phenomenal things for this community and come up with great projects, whether it's the Challenge Fund or whether it's the Centennial Fund or whether it's the Millennium Funds that raised us $50 or $60 million. But here's the point. Bob recognized that so much of the money that was needed for Jewish education and continues to be needed for Jewish education. And hopefully part of that vision and part of that fundraising skills are going to be used, and I know are being used, to raise money for Jewish education. So when I was Federation president and working with Bob, you know, that's a lot of the things that we talked about on a both short-term and long-term basis. The ideas that we had for increasing dollars to Jewish education were things that we were in very clear agreement on. And you know, again, without Bob's support, and maybe Bob could say without my support, but without our mutual support, for sort of deviating from the way we allocated dollars. We had never done that. And believe me, there were people who thought that wasn't the greatest thing to do. But we were able to do it, and I think the community's better for it. At least I hope it is.
Yeah. So since you raised it, it was further down my list, but I want to share with us a little bit more about how you view the volunteer professional partnership, not only at the president and CEO level, but through the system. What are the roles you see as the Jewish communal professional playing, and the lay volunteer leadership playing, and how they merge together to make our community most effective?
I can't overemphasize the importance of the Jewish professional and my tremendous admiration for the great Jewish professionals that we have in this community and that I have worked with. It is never, in my view, a us and them kind of relationship. It is truly, to have a successful community, it's got to be, and I always viewed it as, a partnership and a symbiotic relationship where each fed off the other, and each in the most positive way. You know, the Jewish professionals in this community are amazingly dedicated, very talented, and if they weren't, could probably be making a lot more money doing something else in many, if not most cases. they're the foot soldiers. I mean, they're there every day in the trenches doing all the work. And, you know, the professionals deserve most of the credit for the successes that we have. But, you know, their job a lot of the time is to get the lay leaders involved, to get the volunteers involved, to get them committed, as an Aronson did, as a Dick Lobenthal did, as an Abe Foxman did, you know. And probably had we not been doing this kind of interview, Michael, I might not have thought of putting all those folks together and reflecting on, you know, those three people who were so significant in, you know, formulating my Jewish thinking and my view of our community. But you know, going forward, that relationship probably will be even closer than it ever has been. And we are certainly in a situation today where the vast, vast majority of money that is raised in the community is not raised by and large by volunteers, but is raised by Jewish professionals.
Is that a good thing in your opinion, Peter?
No. It's probably necessary given the way things have developed. I'd love to see a closer working relationship. You know, a lot of folks used to say, well, that's just because the way it's developed in this community is just because Bob Aronson has been so dominant on the fundraising side. But when you look at the statistics from other communities around the country, the most successful communities have the same dynamic that's in existence. For whatever reason, the art of fundraising has not been something that many lay people have been doing. I do less cards today than I used to. I'd like to do more. And somebody who's watching this tape will probably tell me I have my opportunity. But you know, a lot of people say, oh, I just don't like fundraising. I don't like to do this. And, you know, I don't like to ask people for money. Well, you know, I don't like to pay taxes either, but I got to do it. And so I think it's just a vital thing that needs to be done. And I try to tell folks to remember they're not asking for money for themselves. They're asking money for the greater good and for a greater cause. And I'm always proud to ask people for money. Sometimes they say no. Most of the time they say yes. And speaking a little bit more about the lay professional relationship, I know I've learned so much from a lot of our professionals, not just on the fundraising side, but on the process side, on the institutional knowledge side, on how things work in the community. And there is no doubt in my mind that the Jewish professionals in our community have made me a better Jew and a better leader in the community. I would not have been able to come close to succeeding to whatever level I have without those Jewish professionals.
So let's talk just a little bit more about your evolution from junior division to the presidency. What were some of
It happened overnight, Michael. Just overnight.
It probably could have.
No, it could not have. Not even a small chance.
So let's talk about that. What were, you know, the 2 or 3 or 4 things, important things along that path that really you feel influenced you and motivated you to continue your involvement at the Federation? I think that would be a useful...
I never thought of not continuing my involvement at Federation.
But there had to be certain things that really stick out and stand out.
Well, you know, there were. I can say honestly and truly, I never was looking ahead. Maybe until I became sort of a more senior vice president at Federation and said, you know, I got a shot at being president. But before that, I never thought about it. I was in awe of many of the folks who had been president of Federation. I thought it was a fantastic honor, an honor that I didn't know if I'd ever deserve. But it definitely started with, in earnest, with the Young Leadership Cabinet. The Young Leadership Cabinet made me feel like whatever I wanted to do Jewishly, I could do. and I was given the tools. The passion I had was reinforced, and the community was very receptive to everything that the various folks on the Young Leadership Cabinet were doing. Secondly, I think being campaign chair and being willing and, in a lot of ways, I would say eager to do the various campaign activities. You know, being involved in various divisions, and then in the old days, you know, the lawyers division, and then when we switched and had, you know, divisions based on the amount of dollars being given, you know, the $5,000 division, the $10,000 division, the $25,000 division. And then I guess since I had shared all the divisions, they said, well, we got to do something with this guy, so they decided to make me campaign chair. That was a great experience. That was in '99 and 2000. We had co-chairs, and we still have co-chairs. My co-chair was Linda Klein. We got along famously. Linda was fantastic.
Special person.
I love Linda, loved her then. Well, then I didn't know her as well, but I loved what I knew. And we became very close as campaign co-chairs, and have stayed close since then. That was a great experience. And when Linda and I were co-chairs, we took a trip to the former Soviet Union, which also was a great bonding experience, to the former Soviet Union and then to Israel, with Laura Linder, who was our campaign director at the time. We loved Laura as well. And we were in Minsk, and I forget where else. But there's nothing like a few days in Minsk for you to love Detroit, you know, to appreciate what you have. And that's true of so many of the trips. Don't complain until you've seen some of the other places in the Jewish world where you could be. And I've had the privilege of traveling to it was then the Soviet Union, and to the former Soviet Union as well. And
you and I went together on one of those.
We did. And so you know exactly, you know, you've been on many of them, so you know what it was like. So those were two great experiences. My involvement with the Allied Jewish Campaign, the Alliance for Jewish Education, and my various commitments to Jewish education and carrying out a lot of the tasks associated with that. And when I chaired what was then called the Conference of Chairmen of the Planning and Budgeting Divisions, now it's called the PASC, that was a great experience, which I think required a lot of skills learned and negotiation and whatnot. So those couple, 3, 4 things, when you put it all together, you know, helped prepare me and move me in the right direction to permit me at some time, which was in 2004, to become Federation President. Unquestionably the highlight of my Jewish life, and one of the highlights of my life. There's nothing that I love doing more, as huge a time commitment as it was, you know, on the back of carrying on and out a legal practice, which was fairly demanding. But I had a great time. I worked with great people, and it was a busy time, and it was a time where, you know, a number of tough decisions had to be made. Particularly, I remember one of the first ones was with the Jewish Community Center. And as many who were around will recall, the Jewish Center was on a very, 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 did I say very, very, very significant downward spiral, to the point that people were talking about maybe having to mothball the Jewish Community Center. Do you remember that, Michael?
Yeah, I do.
And There were people at high levels in this community who thought that was the right way to go. I'm not among them, and the problem was that the center was out of control in terms of its budgetary handling of budget. And you know, we were often told that we're on budget, we're only a little off budget, and then at the end of the year they'd be $200,000, $300,000, $500,000, $700,000 out of whack. And that was not something that we could easily handle. And one of my closest friends had just become the president of the Jewish Community Center, Erwin Alterman. And he just brought in this new executive director, straight from Texas, Mark Litt. And Erwin came to me and said, "Peter, I need you to do me a favor. Give me a year to get organized as the new president and with Mark Litt." And I said, "Erwin, I love you, but I can't give you a year." The time for what we call tuchas auf den Tisch, you know, get your butt on the table and let's get this done, was now. And Bob Aronson and I had a number of meetings with Erwin and Mark, and told them basically that you know, there was no more, quote, extra money available. The golden goose was no longer doling out extra money, and that they had to get their act together pretty quickly, or else there would be some very dire consequences. We did agree to make them a loan, and we agreed that we were going to pay ourselves back out of their allocation. And they said, "Well, then you need to increase our allocation." And we said, "We're not going to do that. We can't do that. We don't have the resources to do that. And to do that would in effect be rewarding someone for, and rewarding an agency for not getting the job done that they're supposed to get done. How do we tell Jewish Family Services that they can't take care of the people who need to be taken care of?" So, and I think there we can say that Erwin and Mark, particularly Mark Litt, did an amazing, amazing job of turning around the Jewish Center, and I can say restoring the Jewish Center to its old glory and going beyond it. I have a lovely friendship with Mark. Of course, I still have one with Erwin, but developed a lovely friendship with Mark, and I think Mark is a great Jewish professional who has done a fantastic, fantastic job at the Jewish Center, culminating probably in the Berman Center for the Performing Arts, which is another jewel and really another feather in our community's cap. So the Jewish Center is alive and well and prospering.
Good. I have a few more community questions, but I would absolutely be remiss if we didn't get to the most important question of this whole interview, and that's to have you talk just a little bit about your family and your wife and children. We've talked about them a little, you know, you've talked about your kids and how they fit into this whole dynamic. I want to certainly put that on the record.
I absolutely want to put that on the record, and I was waiting for you to ask me, so I'm glad you did. Barbara and I have been married 15 years. She is my unwavering support and my great love at all times. Sometimes she doesn't understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, but she's been there supporting me, and you know, she has my everlasting love and appreciation for all of that. She herself comes from a family that has been involved in Federation, maybe on a different level, but a family, also the Etkin family, very devoted to Technion, and her dad was involved at the highest levels of Technion, and my mother-in-law Toby continues to be a great supporter of Technion, as does my brother-in-law Doug, and as you know, Doug is currently the foundation president. And I don't mind saying on the record that I do take some credit for increasing the level of Doug's involvement in Federation. And obviously he's done whatever he's done on his own, but trying to persuade him and cajole him nicely in the early years that it was a great place to be. And I think he has seen that and has done a wonderful, wonderful job in his involvement and as president of the foundation. For Barbara, Barbara's not that involved in the foundation, but she's a phenomenal mother and a phenomenal wife, not only, and now happily, a phenomenal grandmother, which is, you know, one of the great joys of her life. We have two grandsons, one 13 months old, Jackson, who lives in Denver, and Ricky, who is less than 3 months old, who lives quite nearby in Ferndale, Michigan. So we're delighted about both of them and excited that we're going to have a third grandchild in February. That's going to be our first granddaughter to our son Daniel and his wife Leslie, who live in Chicago. And we're on our way to hopefully a big crew of grandchildren. We have 4 kids. 2 are mine by birth and 2 are Barbara's by birth. Mine are Daniel, who is 35 years old and is in Chicago at J.P. Morgan, where he's doing really well. And you know, he's involved on what I would have to call the periphery of the Jewish community. He goes to events because Leslie asks him to, or because some friend of theirs is being honored, or some friend of theirs invited him. But you know, at the little speech he gave when I received my Butzel Award, we had a little dinner before that. And I do recall very distinctly him saying that he's going to get involved in the Jewish community. I've only reminded him of that once, since it was in October, just a couple of months ago. But I do intend to remind him about that again. He has all the tools, and I'm sure he can do a phenomenal job at whatever he undertook to do in the Jewish community. The same is true of Jessica, my daughter, who's 32 and is in San Francisco, utilizing her MBA skills. She's got her own startup now. She was with another startup from the time she got out of business school, and that startup had what they call a good exit, maybe a great exit. I guess if she has one regret about that, too bad she didn't own 50% of the stock. But you know, be that as it may, she has been involved in Jewish community activity. She does say getting involved in San Francisco is a whole lot different than getting involved in Detroit, and you know, it's another example of being able to appreciate what we have in this community and the fantastic, cohesive, really, Jewish community that we have, not only with respect to Federation, but across the board. The same is not true in San Francisco, which makes it a little tougher for her to get involved. She had been involved when she lived in Chicago, and for the first few years she was in San Francisco in AIPAC, which she was very committed to. She's a little less involved in AIPAC now, and maybe a little bit more involved in her business. She has, I think, a strong interest in things Jewish and doing things Jewish. Where that'll take her, I don't know, but I have every confidence that whatever decision she makes in that regard will be the right one. Barbara's daughters, Jody and Nicole, are like my second and third daughters because I've known them so long. They weren't even teenagers when I met them, and they're fantastic women who have both seen fit to give us a grandson in the last 12, 13 months. So that's great. Jody lives with our husband Joe in Denver, outside of Denver, and she's a great mom and very devoted mom and daughter. And Nicole lives here with her husband Rick, and an equally devoted mother and daughter, just that she's able to show it a little more because she's here in Ferndale, and we're thrilled to have them here, and we invite any of our other children, wherever located, to come back. And we've told them that the grandchildren who live in Michigan are going to be favored. So they can take that any way they want. And obviously we're going to be able to spend a lot of quality time with those who are nearest by. So we're excited about all of our grandchildren as we embark on the next generation of our next generation.
Thank you. I think that's getting to a serious offshoot of what you just articulated for us. I don't think that you're atypical in that 3 out of your 4 children no longer live in Detroit. And I think, from my perspective, that is one of the major challenges that is facing us. I want you to share whether or not you share that same concern and what you believe we as a community can do to attract people not to leave and to attract those like your 3 children who are away to return to Detroit. Is that something that, I think it's something worth our talking about?
It is. I wish there were a simple answer.
There is no simple answer.
There is no simple answer. It's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. It's an issue that was discussed in earnest during the 3 years that I was Federation President. I've had many discussions about it with Bob Aronson before and after that. While I think there is a role for us to play as a Jewish community, I think it is not reasonable to think that the issue involves the way our Jewish community is or what it does. The single biggest problem was expressed to me by my daughter who lives in San Francisco. She said, "Dad, one word answer, JOBS, jobs. Where are the best jobs? Where is the excitement in the job arena? That's where people are going to go." No, it's not that the Jewish community doesn't have a Shabbaton that they should have. It's not that the shuls aren't inviting enough. It's not that Federation doesn't reach out enough to young people. In fact, I think our young adult division is tremendous. I think they've had great leadership, lay and professional. I think they've had great support. I know the community and Federation supports it, so it's not that. I think we need to have a seat at the table for the discussions that are taking place. Whether those discussions are taking place through organizations like, the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, or little subgroups that are being formed by them, or whether it's through a broader coalition, and whether it's through other organizations. We need to be at the table. We need to be able to express our point of view. We need to support the activities both financially and philosophically and practically. And we should do outreach that we're undertaking. But there is no panacea to say that we either can keep people here or bring people back. Don't want to make too many references to Bob Aronson, but Bob came up with what I thought was a great idea, that some people said, well, why would you be doing that? And that was the idea, to have little fun gatherings or fundraising gatherings in different communities in America for former Detroiters and for young adults, folks in their 20s and 30s. And we've done that in Los Angeles, we've done that in New York, we've done that in Chicago. And in a way, it's just kind of a brilliant idea. You're going to get a lot of Detroiters together. There are going to be some Detroiters who come to those events. You're going to raise a little bit of money for the Detroit Federation. And hopefully you're going to get some people thinking about, you know what, that Detroit community, they're terrific. I really want to see what I can do to come back. But I think, Michael, the bottom line is, unless we have the jobs to attract them, and jobs at the level that they want to be or above the level they want to be. You know, and we talked about your son-in-law coming here, you know. He was not going to leave a job at a major Fortune 500 company just to come to take any old job that could be available in Detroit. And fortunately, he's obviously a talented guy. He got a significant job here. But being able to duplicate that for hundreds or thousands of other people is complicated. And, you know, I'm very supportive of the effort to improve Detroit, which I think is also an enormous, enormous challenge. But we can't do that just by, we have to increase the mass that we have. We can't just sort of play musical chairs with a company moving from one city in Southeast Michigan and moving some or most of their people to Detroit. It's a good start, but we have to increase the critical mass to a level where that can really make a difference and make it a cool place to be, make it a place that has serious jobs and the like. And if anybody can do it,
yeah, I was going to ask you actually. It's on, you know, it's one of the questions that weren't sent to you, but it really relates itself to what we, and it's the whole jobs thing and Federation's responsibility to the city of Detroit to make Detroit more vital and vibrant, that will allow people to think about Detroit where they discount it completely, at least think about it. And does Federation have a role? And you've suggested that they do have a role, and they should have a role.
I think they do. I think they should have. I think they recognize that they have a role. How that role exactly evolves over a period of time, I'm not sure yet. But certainly to be a cheerleader for Detroit in a variety of ways, financial and otherwise, is important. Maybe to have events in Detroit to support those who are doing the kinds of things that Dan Gilbert is. Maybe it's to have a young adult meeting at the Quicken Loan headquarters downtown as a way of showcasing what we have and what we can do. Look, it's a very small step in a very big process and a very complicated process. But if we're at the table, we can hear what is being said. We can decide how we want to participate. We can't walk away from the table. We can't absent ourselves from that, because for Michigan to succeed, for Southeast Michigan to succeed, Detroit's got to succeed.
Yeah, that's terrific. I'm going to shift gears because I know time is a little bit limited, and I want to go back across the waters and just get your perceptions and sense about our friend in the Middle East, Israel, and the challenges that are growing by the day. And I want you to know I had all the things, you know, I had Cabinet, I had Miracle Mission, I had ADL. All of those things were things that I had jotted down to ask you about that weren't on this original list.
We're rolling, so.
We're rolling.
You know, here's what Israel's biggest problem is. It really isn't a different problem than they've had since 1948. They live in a bad neighborhood. And sometimes that neighborhood's a little worse than it is at other times, but it's an awfully bad neighborhood, no matter when you've been looking at it. And you know, as many people predicted, the Arab Spring is bringing a very cold winter for a lot of folks. If you're Israeli or pro-Israel, as I am, and as pretty much anybody who's going to listen to this is, you know, what can Israel do about it? How do I assess the situation? Maybe I'm a bit of a pundit, but I'm not an expert. I think Israel's got to continue to do what it's been doing. And obviously, being able to have peace in the Middle East, including the establishment of a so-called Palestinian state, would be fantastic. And I am a strong supporter of a two-state solution. My unwavering view has been for a number of years that the Palestinians don't really want to make a deal with Israel. And the minute Israel can make a deal with the Palestinians immediately are not going to want that deal. That's really the biggest problem that I see. You know, sometimes Israel is a little more demanding, sometimes a little less demanding, but I don't see that the fundamental problem is on the Israeli side. The fundamental problem is having a partner who you can negotiate with and a partner who wants to negotiate. You can have a partner that you can negotiate with, but that partner doesn't really want to negotiate, you know. That happens in a lot of my litigations, you know. I've always got a partner on the other side, but sometimes one of us doesn't want to negotiate. And we might even say we want to negotiate, but we're just kidding. The Iran threat is obviously a huge threat. I had a dream not too long ago that there was a revolution in Iran and they threw out the Ayatollahs. I don't think that's far-fetched. I just don't know if it's going to happen in short order. The more talk there is about Israel attacking Iran and trying to take out its nuclear strike force, I think the less likely it is to happen. Israel does not want to announce in advance its military or other clandestine plans. That seems counterintuitive. So to me, at the moment, I don't think there's anything on the horizon which would suggest unilateral action by Israel, nor do I personally think unilateral action by Israel is a good idea. It might be a way to ratchet up the American congressional and executive/presidential community to appreciate and understand in the strongest possible terms the severity of the threat. You know, recently Leon Panetta made a speech which was appropriately criticized by the pro-Israel community, you know, saying that Netanyahu just has to get to the damn table. I don't think the problem is in getting Netanyahu to the table. I think the problem is getting the Palestinians to the table without preconditions. The Israelis are willing to sit down at the table. Just don't ask me to give up a lot of my negotiating positions as a condition for sitting down at the table. I think any person who has engaged in negotiations or has litigated can appreciate that. Does that mean there could never be any precondition that would ever be acceptable to Israel? No, it doesn't mean that. But it means substantial or substantive preconditions are not likely to be met on either side, nor should there be a reasonable expectation that they will be. But Israel has to maintain its strength throughout the Jewish world. Not only, I'm not talking just about military strength, and that's where we play a significant role. You know, we have got to not only be supportive of Israel, but we have to be in a position to rally the troops. And Federation plays a significant role in every community in being able to do that and make sure that we maintain the strong relationship that we've had with Israel. To some extent, you know, the Jewish federations of North America are retrenching a bit from that because of pressure from other federations, pressures in a way that's understandable and that reflects, you know, a decrease in fundraising in various communities, and that result of decrease in fundraising means that most of the decrease is going to fall on the back of Israel, and Israel's going to get less money because certain amounts of money are needed to run each of the local communities. So if we can make a contribution, it's to redouble our efforts to raise the maximum dollars we can so that Israel continues to get its fair share of dollars and fair share of support from each federation in the American Jewish community.
My one political question to you is related to this. What is your sense from a very wide berth of experience about America's continuing support of Israel as we move forward in the future? And I guess I could tack on to that, does Federation have a role in, maintaining that support?
Well, since you called this your one political question, I'll give you my one political answer. I am satisfied and convinced of continuing American support for Israel, regardless of who the President of the United States is. Both because I think that is necessary, demanded, and recognized by whomever the President is, including Barack Obama, and recognized by the Congress, of course. And the Congress has its own ways of putting pressure on and making sure the President does what he's supposed to do. I think by and large, let the record reflect that I do not share the criticism of Barack Obama, against Barack Obama regarding Israel. I think he is a strong supporter of Israel, but at the same time seeks to recognize that the way to get things done is by trying to strike some sort of balance. Has he always succeeded? No. Has he always done what I would have done? No. Am I worried about his support for Israel? No, I'm not. I also believe very strongly, and I've made this up, so maybe others will disagree with me. I think that if we had a different president, if George Bush were president, for instance, and nobody can question the fact that George Bush was a strong supporter of Israel, no matter what else he did or didn't do, I think George Bush would not have been able to convince, as this president did, a majority, the necessary members of the UN Security Council. I think you need 9 votes in order to move the Palestinian statehood initiative forward. The Palestinians could only get 8. They got stuck at 8, which means that 7, if I have my numbers right, wouldn't support that initiative. Either they'd be against it or they'd abstain or whatever they had to do. I think that Barack Obama was uniquely capable, with whoever the UN delegation was, of doing that. And that I think if Bush had been president, he wouldn't have been able to convince some of those, what I should say, less involved countries to support his direction, because he believes he's proved that he is a, relatively speaking, an honest broker in trying to get folks to the table and trying to set conditions for how the two-state solution is arrived at. People could disagree with me, and maybe rightly so, but again, that doesn't mean I think everything that President Obama has done has been ideal with respect to Israel. Things could be improved, but in terms of American support for Israel, regardless of who the President of the United States is, over the foreseeable future, as far as I can see into the future, I think it's solid and assured.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Last question, it's going to be throughout this interview, you've talked about people who have influenced you, and it's a long and distinguished list. I just wanted you to think if there are other people you would want to acknowledge in this section. And we've talked a lot about the challenges for the community. If there are any of those challenges that we perhaps have missed, and you want to articulate that.
I think we've covered largely, Michael, the folks who have influenced me, growing up over the years. I mean, there are others who I've admired greatly and have influenced me as well. In recent years, I've spent a lot of time with Rabbi Avi Cohen, and just having a delightful time studying with him almost on a weekly basis. And we've studied a variety of Jewish texts. We do it in Hebrew, which is, a great joy to me. I love being able to speak Hebrew and learn Hebrew, and Avi is not only a great rabbi and a great Jewish scholar, but is a fantastic Hebrew speaker. So that just a terrific amalgam of different circumstances. We've learned things from Shir HaShirim to Yehoshua to Shoftim to a lot of other things over the last half dozen years that we've been studying together, and I look forward to studying with him for a lot more years. And a number of my most senior partners at my prior law firm, Honigman, Miller, Schwartz, and Cohn, each one of them in their own way has influenced me. Aron, who was the most outspoken and dynamic of the group in terms of Jewish leadership, Alan E. Schwartz with his quiet and very effective leadership in the Jewish and non-Jewish community. Jason Honigman, who always got to the point so quickly and clearly and directly and let you know what he was thinking. Hopefully sharpened me in a lot of ways. And Jack Miller, who was the glue that held that firm together and taught me a lot of things about dealing with people, dealing with the community. And as you know, Jack was president of the Jewish Center years ago, and I considered him not only a great lawyer, but a great friend. So those are some of the other people that have influenced me in a variety of ways over the years. As to your second question, in terms of the challenges we face and what we're dealing with, I think nothing is more important to helping us maintain our Jewish identity than making sure we maintain our connection with Israel, and that can best be done by trips and missions to Israel. Some of my really greatest Jewish experiences and experiences of any kind have been on trips to Israel. The miracle mission that I was on, the miracle mission that Richard Krugel and I led, trips to that combined, like I told you earlier, my campaign co-chaired trip to Minsk and Israel. All of those trips had such significant impact on me and my thinking, and I would be totally remiss if I didn't recount the fantastic experience we had in going on the family miracle mission about 4 or 5 years ago, where we had a chance to take our kids and spend a lot of quality time together and experience Israel together as a family. There was nothing like it. You could say that maintaining that Jewish identity also needs to be done through the synagogue and through religious observance and ritual observance, and I think that's true. But for me, as a Jew that believes in a lot of traditions, but is not himself that observant and that religious in a traditional sense, I think we ought to do everything that we can to strengthen our synagogues, but not to forget that in doing that, we also need to really not just maintain, but even intensify our relationship with the Israel experience, because I think that is a 7 or 10 day trip to Israel has a decades-long, if not lifetime-long effect on people. And that's why everything that Birthright has been doing for the last, maybe 8 or 10 years has been so tremendously significant, and I think is going to reap rewards for our collective Jewish community for years to come. So when I think of what we need to do, obviously we need to do all of the basics. from Jewish education on down, caring for our community, making sure that we have a strong Klal Yisrael in our midst and across the board of all the folks we deal with. But one of the very best ways to do that is, in my view, by maintaining our strong connection with Israel and missions to Israel.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your time. This was a treat for me and a pleasure to having been able to conduct this interview with you. And to catch up was great.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to have you here and to ask me to do the interview. Thank you.